Welcome to Night Owl Podcast History. Tonight, we invite you to embark on a journey through time, a journey that stretches back to the heart of one of the greatest civilizations the world has ever known, the Roman Empire. For centuries, Rome was the beating heart of Europe, a city that rose from a cluster of huts on the banks of the Tiber River to the center of a world-spanning empire. Its armies marched across continents, its laws shaped nations, its culture left imprints so deep that we can still feel them in our lives today. But here is the mystery that has haunted historians for centuries. How could something so vast, so powerful, so enduring come crashing down? Why did the Roman Empire fall, and what did that collapse mean for the future of Europe? Imagine this for a moment, a world where aqueducts carried fresh water for miles, where roads connected distant provinces, where mighty legions stood ready to defend an empire that stretched from Britain to the sands of Egypt. Now imagine those same roads crumbling, the aqueducts abandoned, the legions disbanded, and cities that once glowed with marble grandeur now lying in ruins. It is a story of glory and ruin, of power and fragility, of lessons that echo across history. And it is this story we are about to unfold together. Before we begin, let me gently remind you, if you find yourself drawn into this world of history, if you enjoy traveling back through time with us, make sure to subscribe to Night Owl Podcast History. A simple click will keep you connected with stories of the past that shape our present, and sharing this with friends helps keep history alive for more curious minds like yours. And now, let us dive into the Night Owl Podcast. Now, let us step back into the fading days of Rome. To understand why Rome fell, we must first understand how Rome rose. For an empire to collapse, it must first be immense. And Rome was nothing less than immense. The city of Rome itself was founded, according to tradition, in the year 753 before Christ, with the tale of Romulus and Remus, the twin brothers suckled by a she-wolf. From that mythical beginning, Rome grew slowly, at first ruled by kings, then by the Republic after the overthrow of Tarquin the Proud around 509 before Christ. The Republic, with its Senate, its consuls, and its assemblies, created a system of shared power that allowed Rome to expand steadily. By the time of Julius Caesar in the 1st century before Christ, the Roman Republic was already struggling under the weight of its success. Torn between aristocrats and populists, between generals with personal armies, and the Senate that tried to restrain them. When Caesar was assassinated in 44 before Christ, Rome was plunged into chaos. But out of that chaos emerged Augustus, Caesar's adopted heir, who became the first emperor. Augustus established the Principate, a monarchy disguised as a republic. And under his reign, Rome entered an era of relative peace and prosperity known as the Pax Romana. For 2 centuries, Rome flourished. Cities rose, trade thrived, and Roman law brought a semblance of order across its provinces. The empire stretched from the Atlantic Ocean to the Euphrates River, from the deserts of North Africa to the misty highlands of Scotland. It was, in every sense, a superpower of the ancient world. Yet beneath this grandeur lay cracks. Rome's wealth was built on conquest, but conquest eventually slowed. The cost of maintaining the empire's vast borders drained resources. Political corruption seeped into the Senate and the imperial court. The dependence on slave labor stifled technological progress, while the growing gap between rich and poor sowed discontent. Over time, the challenges multiplied. The empire became too vast to manage effectively. Armies loyal to their generals rather than the state often plunged Rome into civil war. Ambitious men fought for the purple robe of the emperor, and with every conflict, the empire weakened a little more. By the 3rd century after Christ, the Roman Empire entered a period historians call the crisis of the 3rd century. Between the years 235 and 284, Rome was torn apart by nearly constant civil war. Emperors rose and fell with alarming speed. Some reigned for only months before being overthrown or assassinated. The empire fractured into breakaway states, the Gallic Empire in the west and the Palmyrene Empire in the east. Plague ravaged the population, while invasions from Germanic tribes battered the frontiers. It seemed as though Rome was on the brink of dissolution. But then came Diocletian, who became emperor in 284 after Christ. Diocletian was a reformer, a man who understood that the empire in its old form could no longer survive. He divided the empire into two halves, east and west, appointing a co-emperor to help govern. This system, known as the Tetrarchy, was meant to stabilize Rome, and in many ways it did, at least for a time. The eastern half of the empire, with its wealthier cities and stronger trade networks, began to flourish. Constantinople, founded by Emperor Constantine in 330 after Christ, became a new capital in the east, while Rome remained the symbolic heart of the west. Yet this division also revealed something fundamental. The empire was no longer one. The west, poorer, more rural, more vulnerable to invasions, began to falter. The East, which we now call the Byzantine Empire, endured for another 1,000 years. The story of the fall of Rome is, in truth, the story of the fall of the Western Roman Empire. In the West, pressure mounted from all sides. The frontiers were besieged by Germanic tribes, the Goths, the Vandals, the Franks, the Saxons. These were not always hostile invaders. Often they were migrants, entire peoples seeking land, safety, and opportunity within the empire. Rome, weakened, sometimes allowed them to settle as allies, known as foederati, but these arrangements often broke down, leading to conflict. In 378 after Christ, at the Battle of Adrianople, the Eastern Roman army suffered a catastrophic defeat at the hands of the Visigoths, a shock that revealed Rome's vulnerability. The legions, once invincible, were no longer the unstoppable force they had been. As the 5th century dawned, the Western Empire faced crises it could no longer contain. In 410, the unimaginable happened. Rome itself was sacked by the Visigoths under their king Alaric. For centuries, Romans had believed their city eternal, protected by the gods, immune to the fate of ordinary kingdoms. The sack of Rome shattered that illusion. Though the city would recover, its aura of invincibility was gone. Over the next decades, the Western Empire stumbled on, but its strength was ebbing away. Britain was abandoned to the Anglo-Saxons. Spain fell to the Visigoths. North Africa, once Rome's breadbasket, was seized by the Vandals. Finally, in 476 after Christ, the last Western Roman emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed by a Germanic chieftain named Odoacer. Officially, this marked the end of the Western Roman Empire. The Eastern Empire, centered in Constantinople, still called itself Roman, but in the West, the empire was no more. And yet, the fall of Rome was not merely the fall of a political structure. It was the beginning of something new. The collapse of the empire opened the way for medieval Europe, a patchwork of kingdoms and cultures that would eventually give rise to modern nations. The legacy of Rome lived on, in language, in law, in architecture, and in the very idea of Europe itself. The fall of Rome was not just an ending, it was a transformation. As we continue this story, we will explore not only why Rome fell, but how its fall reshaped Europe, how new kingdoms rose from its ruins, how Christianity spread and took root, how knowledge was preserved and lost, and how the memory of Rome haunted kings and emperors for centuries to come. Stay with me, for this journey is just beginning. When Rome's political power in the West dissolved in 476 after Christ, the world did not suddenly collapse into silence. Life for ordinary farmers, merchants, and artisans often went on in much the same way it had before. Fields still needed to be tilled, bread still needed to be baked, and markets still bustled with trade. But over time, the absence of Roman authority reshaped the map of Europe and the daily rhythms of life. What had once been an empire united under Roman law and guarded by Roman legions became a fractured landscape of competing kingdoms, where new cultures mingled with old Roman traditions. To grasp the magnitude of this transformation, let us first linger for a moment in the city of Rome itself. Even after the deposition of Romulus Augustulus, the city did not vanish. Senators still debated in the Curia, Christian bishops still led their congregations, and the ruins of once magnificent buildings loomed over the narrow streets. Yet there was no emperor in Rome any longer, and the great baths, aqueducts, and amphitheaters that had symbolized Roman civilization gradually fell into disrepair. Weeds sprouted in marble courtyards, and the Colosseum, once filled with the roar of the crowd, slowly became a quarry where stones were stripped away for new constructions. The eternal city endured, but it endured as a shadow of its former self. Meanwhile, outside Italy, the power vacuum left by Rome's fall gave rise to new rulers. In Gaul, the Franks, a Germanic people, began to carve out a kingdom that would eventually evolve into modern France. Their most famous early king, Clovis, converted to Christianity in 496 after Christ, a decision that bound his dynasty to the Roman Church and gave the Franks legitimacy in the eyes of both their subjects and neighboring rulers. This moment was pivotal, for it demonstrated how the authority of Rome did not entirely vanish, but was absorbed and reimagined by those who came after. In Spain, the Visigoths established their own kingdom. In Italy, Odoacer ruled as king, but he maintained many Roman traditions, even recognizing the authority of the Eastern emperor. The Vandals, meanwhile, held North Africa, controlling the grain supplies that had once fed Rome. These were no longer provinces of a single empire, but independent realms with their own ambitions. Europe was becoming a mosaic, its pieces shifting constantly as tribes and kingdoms rose and fell. Amidst this fragmentation, one institution stood firm: the Christian Church. As imperial power receded, the Church became a unifying force, offering stability and continuity in a time of change. The Bishop of Rome, later known as the Pope, gained growing influence, not only as a religious leader but also as a political figure. Monasteries sprouted across Europe, becoming centers of learning, preservation, and spiritual life. In their scriptoria, monks painstakingly copied manuscripts, preserving fragments of Roman literature, philosophy, and law that might otherwise have been lost forever. Without this quiet labor, much of Rome's intellectual heritage could have vanished into oblivion. Yet we should not imagine this period, often called the so-called Dark Ages, as simply dark. The phrase was coined much later by Renaissance scholars who looked back and saw a decline from the brilliance of classical antiquity. But in reality, this was an age of transformation. Roman roads still carried travelers, though many crumbled. Roman laws influenced the codes of new kingdoms. Latin remained the language of the church and of scholarship, even as local dialects evolved into the early forms of French, Spanish, and Italian. The bones of Rome were still present, shaping the new Europe that was emerging. Of course, life was harder without the centralized infrastructure of the empire. Trade networks shrank, cities dwindled, and long-distance commerce slowed. With the fall of Roman administration, local lords became the new protectors and rulers, leading to the feudal system that would define much of medieval Europe. Power was fragmented, loyalty was personal rather than imperial, and society became structured around bonds of obligation between lord and vassal, knight and peasant. The glittering urban civilization of Rome gave way to a more rural, localized world. Still, there were sparks of resilience and adaptation. Consider the city of Ravenna, which became the capital of the Western Roman Empire in its final decades. After the fall, Ravenna remained a cultural bridge between East and West, adorned with stunning mosaics commissioned by its new rulers. These mosaics, glittering in gold and deep blues, told stories of faith and power, blending Roman artistic traditions with Christian themes. Ravenna stood as a reminder that while Rome the empire had fallen, Rome the culture was being reborn in new forms. The Eastern Empire, or Byzantine Empire as we now call it, continued to see itself as the true heir of Rome. From Constantinople, emperors like Justinian the Great in the 6th century sought to reclaim the lost provinces of the West. Justinian's armies did briefly retake Italy and North Africa, and under his rule, the great codification of Roman law, the Corpus Juris Civilis, was compiled, a collection that would influence European legal systems for centuries. But Justinian's victories proved temporary, and the West remained fragmented. Yet even in failure, the Byzantines carried forward the Roman torch, preserving its traditions until the Ottoman conquest of Constantinople in 1453. The question remains, why did Rome fall in the first place? Historians have debated countless explanations. Some point to the economic strains of maintaining such a vast empire. Others to political corruption, to military decline, to invasions by barbarian tribes, or even to environmental factors like plagues and climate change. In truth, the fall of Rome was not a single event with a single cause, but a long process, a gradual unraveling of systems that had once seemed unshakable. It was the weight of many crises, economic, political, social, and military, that eventually brought the empire to its knees. And yet, as we reflect on this fall, we must also reflect on its legacy. Rome's decline gave birth to Europe as we know it. The Franks, the Visigoths, the Anglo-Saxons, the Lombards, these were not merely invaders, but the founders of new nations. The Church, carrying the Latin language and Roman ideals, became the custodian of knowledge and the shaper of medieval identity. The idea of Rome itself never disappeared. Medieval kings and emperors, from Charlemagne to the Holy Roman Emperors, claimed to be the heirs of Rome, striving to revive its grandeur in their own image. The story of the fall of Rome is then not only a story of decline, but also a story of continuity and rebirth. It is the story of how the old world passed away and the seeds of the new were sown. And as we continue our journey, we will explore the centuries that followed, when Europe sought to find its place in the shadow of Rome's greatness. We will wander through the dark forests of early medieval Europe, into the halls of Frankish kings, across the fields where knights would one day ride, and into the monasteries where the flickering candlelight kept knowledge alive. For though Rome fell, history marched on. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 after Christ, Europe entered an age that has long been described with words like chaos and darkness. Yet when we look closer, we find that this age was not a simple decline into shadow, but rather a period of remarkable transformation. The collapse of Roman authority cleared the ground for new powers to rise, and in this crucible of change, the foundations of medieval Europe were forged. Let us begin with the Franks, for their kingdom would become one of the most enduring legacies of post-Roman Europe. When Clovis, king of the Franks, converted to Christianity at the end of the 5th century, he did more than adopt a new faith. He tied his dynasty to the spiritual authority of the Roman Church. Unlike other Germanic tribes who had embraced Arian Christianity, a version of the faith deemed heretical by Rome, Clovis and his successors aligned themselves with Orthodox Catholicism. This decision gave the Franks a unique legitimacy. It allowed their rulers to act as protectors of the Church, and in return, the Church lent them its blessing, a bond that would shape European politics for centuries. The Frankish kingdom grew under the Merovingian dynasty, but it was under the Carolingians that it reached its zenith. In the year 800 after Christ, on Christmas Day, Pope Leo III crowned Charlemagne as emperor in Rome. This act was symbolic, a declaration that the Roman Empire, at least in spirit, had not truly vanished. The coronation of Charlemagne gave birth to what would later be called the Holy Roman Empire, an institution that sought to unite Europe under both spiritual and temporal authority. Though the empire was never as centralized or powerful as ancient Rome, the very idea of reviving Roman grandeur became a driving force in European history. But the story of post-Roman Europe was not only about kings and emperors. It was also about the everyday structures of society that grew up to replace imperial systems. Without the central bureaucracy of Rome, power became localized. Land was the primary source of wealth, and those who controlled land became the new aristocracy. The bonds of loyalty and service that defined feudalism began to take root. Lords offered protection to their vassals, while peasants worked the land in exchange for security. This was a society built on personal ties, on oaths sworn between men, rather than on the abstract authority of a distant emperor. Still, the memory of Rome lingered. Roman roads, though crumbling, guided the routes of medieval travelers. Roman law, codified under Justinian in the East, influenced legal traditions in the West. Even the very idea of Europe as a cultural space was shaped by Rome's shadow. Latin, the language of the Romans, remained the tongue of scholarship, diplomacy, and worship. Priests prayed in Latin, monks copied texts in Latin, and rulers issued decrees in Latin. Though everyday people spoke evolving vernaculars, Latin bound the educated and the religious across the continent in a common cultural fabric. In the monasteries, the torch of knowledge burned faintly but steadily. Picture a monastery in Ireland, its stone walls standing against the wind and rain, its halls echoing with the chants of monks. Within, scribes bent over parchment, quills scratching as they copied the works of Augustine, Virgil, and Aristotle. These monasteries, far from the centers of old Roman power, became the custodians of Western civilization. It is thanks to their labor that so much of the ancient world was preserved. Without them, entire libraries of knowledge might have disappeared into the silence of history. At the same time, Christianity spread into regions Rome had never fully subdued. Missionaries crossed the North Sea into the lands of the Anglo-Saxons, bringing with them not only faith, but literacy, art, and architecture. The fusion of Germanic traditions with Christian beliefs created a new cultural synthesis, visible in illuminated manuscripts where intricate Celtic designs intertwined with biblical stories. These were the seeds of a distinctly medieval identity, one rooted in both the legacy of Rome and the creativity of the peoples who succeeded it. Yet Europe was far from stable. The collapse of Roman authority left the continent vulnerable to waves of new invasions. In the 8th and 9th centuries, Vikings from the north swept across the seas, raiding monasteries and towns with terrifying speed. From the east came the Magyars, skilled horsemen who struck deep into the heart of Europe. From the south, Muslim forces expanded across the Mediterranean, conquering Spain and threatening Italy. These pressures tested the resilience of Europe's fledgling kingdoms, but in surviving them, Europe was forged into a more hardened and adaptive civilization. Meanwhile, in the East, the Byzantine Empire continued to stand as a reminder of what Rome had once been. Constantinople gleamed with its domes and mosaics, a city of wealth and learning. The Byzantines saw themselves as Romans, heirs to Caesar and Augustus, and for centuries they looked westward with both disdain and longing. Their survival meant that the idea of Rome did not vanish entirely, even as the Western Empire lay in ruins. The Byzantines influenced Europe through trade, diplomacy, and religion, especially after the rise of Christianity as a shared faith. So, what did the fall of Rome truly mean for Europe? It meant the end of centralized empire, yes, but it also meant the beginning of diversity. Instead of one empire, there were many kingdoms. Instead of one authority, there were many lords. Instead of one language, many tongues flourished. Europe became a patchwork quilt, each square with its own patterns and colors, yet all stitched together by the lingering threads of Rome and the unifying force of the Church. The transformation was not quick. It took centuries for medieval Europe to take shape. Yet by the time we reach the 10th century, we see a continent that has weathered storms and invasions, that has blended Roman legacies with Germanic traditions, that has embraced Christianity as its guiding faith, and that has begun to define itself in new terms. The fall of Rome was not an apocalypse, it was a metamorphosis. Out of the ruins of empire, a new world was slowly, painfully, beautifully born. As we move forward, let us explore this new world in greater depth. The rise of feudal society, the spread of monasteries, the spark of learning that would one day ignite the Renaissance, and the enduring dream of Rome that haunted every king and emperor who sought to rule Europe. The empire was gone, but its ghost lingered, shaping destinies for centuries to come. In the centuries following the fall of the Western Roman Empire, one institution rose above all others to provide order, stability, and continuity: the Christian Church. Where emperors and senators had vanished, bishops and monks remained. Where Roman legions had marched, processions of priests and pilgrims now walked. In a world where political authority was fragmented and uncertain, the Church became the anchor of society, shaping not only spiritual life, but also culture, politics, and even education. It is important to remember that Christianity was already deeply rooted in the Roman world before the empire collapsed. In 313 after Christ, Emperor Constantine had issued the Edict of Milan, granting religious freedom to Christians after centuries of persecution. By the end of the 4th century, under Emperor Theodosius I, Christianity had become the official religion of the empire. When the Western Empire fell in 476, the faith did not fall with it. Instead, it expanded, carried by missionaries into lands beyond Rome's old frontiers. One of the Church's greatest strengths was its universality. Unlike kingdoms bound to geography or tribes bound to blood, the Church offered a faith that transcended borders. A peasant in Gaul, a nobleman in Spain, a monk in Ireland, and a pilgrim in Italy could all look to the same teachings, recite the same prayers, and revere the same leaders. Latin served as the common tongue of worship and scholarship, creating a cultural unity across an otherwise divided continent. The Bishop of Rome, who came to be known as the Pope, gradually assumed a position of primacy. This was not immediate. In the early centuries, many bishops wielded influence, particularly those in great cities like Constantinople, Alexandria, and Antioch. But the fall of the Western Empire elevated the papacy to new importance. With no emperor in Rome, the Pope became not only a spiritual leader but also a political figure. Popes negotiated with barbarian kings, defended their flocks during sieges, and mediated disputes. They became, in many ways, heirs to the authority once held by Roman governors. Consider Pope Gregory I, known as Gregory the Great, who reigned at the end of the 6th century. Gregory was not only a religious leader, but also a statesman, an administrator, and a patron of learning. He organized the distribution of food to the poor in Rome, reformed the liturgy, and sent missionaries to convert the Anglo-Saxons in Britain. His efforts demonstrated how the papacy could fill the void left by imperial power. Under leaders like Gregory, the papacy became a symbol of continuity, carrying forward the mantle of Rome in a different form. Monasteries, too, played a crucial role in shaping post-Roman Europe. The monastic movement had begun in the deserts of Egypt in the 3rd and 4th centuries, but it spread widely across Europe after the empire's fall. Monasteries were more than places of prayer. They were centers of agriculture, teaching, and preservation. Monks developed new techniques of farming, copied ancient manuscripts, and provided refuge for travelers. In a world where cities declined and literacy waned, monasteries kept alive the flame of learning. The Rule of Saint Benedict, written in the 6th century, provided a framework for monastic life that emphasized discipline, community, and labor. This rule became the foundation of countless monasteries across Europe, shaping the rhythm of daily life for generations. The Church's influence extended far beyond religion. It became the moral compass of medieval society, defining what was right and just. Kings sought the blessing of the Church to legitimize their rule. Charlemagne's coronation by the Pope in the year 800 was not merely a political act, but a spiritual one, reinforcing the idea that true authority came with divine sanction. To defy the Church was to risk both political isolation and eternal damnation. This gave the Church extraordinary leverage, enabling it to shape the course of kingdoms. At the same time, the Church preserved and transmitted the legacy of Rome. Roman law influenced canon law, the body of laws governing the church. Roman architecture inspired the design of basilicas and cathedrals. The Latin language remained alive in prayers, sermons, and texts. In this way, the Church acted as a bridge between antiquity and the Middle Ages, carrying forward the heritage of Rome into the new world being born. Yet the Church was not only conservative, preserving the old, it was also creative, fostering new forms of expression. The spread of Christianity transformed art, turning pagan temples into churches and Roman mosaics into biblical storytelling. Music developed in the form of Gregorian chant, named after Pope Gregory I, whose haunting melodies would echo through the halls of monasteries for centuries. The Church provided not only spiritual guidance, but also the cultural framework within which medieval Europe defined itself. Still, we must not romanticize this era too quickly. The power of the Church also brought conflicts and contradictions. Different interpretations of doctrine led to disputes, sometimes erupting into schisms. The relationship between kings and popes was not always harmonious, as rulers often sought to assert independence from ecclesiastical authority. Moreover, the Church itself accumulated wealth and land, sometimes straying from its spiritual ideals. These tensions would play out over centuries, shaping the drama of medieval politics. Nevertheless, in the vacuum left by the fall of Rome, the Church provided what no king or warlord could: a sense of unity, continuity, and purpose. It offered people not only salvation for their souls, but also stability for their lives. In the dim candlelight of monasteries, in the solemn processions of bishops, in the soaring chants of choirs, the spirit of Rome was reborn in a new, sacred form. This was the great paradox of the fall. Rome the empire had died, but Rome the faith had conquered, carrying its legacy into the medieval world. As we move deeper into this story, we will see how the Church's power shaped the course of European history, how it guided kings, inspired crusades, preserved knowledge, and even sparked conflicts that would alter the continent. The fall of Rome was not the end of civilization. It was the beginning of a civilization defined by faith, by resilience, and by the enduring dream of unity in a fractured world. When the Western Roman Empire collapsed in 476 after Christ, the vacuum of power it left behind did not remain empty for long. Across Europe, new kingdoms rose from the ruins, forged by the so-called barbarian tribes who had once lived at Rome's borders or within its lands. These groups, Franks, Visigoths, Ostrogoths, Vandals, Anglo-Saxons, Lombards, were not merely invaders. They became settlers, rulers, and eventually the architects of Europe's medieval map. To understand how the fall of Rome reshaped the continent, we must look closely at these new powers and how they blended their own traditions with the legacy of Rome. Let us begin with the Franks, perhaps the most influential of all the post-Roman kingdoms. The Franks were a confederation of Germanic tribes who had lived along the Rhine frontier during the late Empire. Unlike some other groups, they did not sweep in through violent conquest, but rather expanded gradually into Roman Gaul. Under their king Clovis, who reigned from 481 to 511, the Franks consolidated power and built a kingdom that would eventually give rise to modern France and Germany. Clovis's story is emblematic of the transformation of Europe. He was a warrior king, leading his men into battles that secured dominance over rival tribes. But his most consequential decision came not on the battlefield, but in the realm of faith. Around the year 496, after a victory in battle, Clovis converted to Catholic Christianity. Unlike many other Germanic rulers who followed the Arian form of Christianity, Clovis aligned himself with the faith of Rome. This decision gave him an extraordinary advantage. It won him the support of the Roman Catholic Church and of the Gallo-Roman population, who saw him not as a conqueror, but as a legitimate ruler in the Roman tradition. With the blessing of the bishops, Clovis became more than a tribal chieftain. He became a king with divine sanction. The dynasty Clovis founded, the Merovingians, ruled for nearly 3 centuries. Though later kings often lacked his vigor, the foundation he laid allowed the Franks to dominate Western Europe. Over time, the Frankish kingdom evolved into the Carolingian Empire under Charlemagne, who would be crowned emperor in the year 800. But it all began with Clovis and his decision to embrace the faith of Rome. In him, we see how the legacy of the empire was not extinguished but carried forward by new rulers who claimed its mantle. Traveling south, we come to Spain, where the Visigoths established their kingdom. The Visigoths had entered Roman territory as refugees in the late 4th century, fleeing the advance of the Huns. After the catastrophic Battle of Adrianople in 378, where they destroyed a Roman army, they roamed the empire as both allies and enemies until they finally settled in Gaul and later in Hispania. By the early 6th century, they had built a kingdom centered around Toledo. The Visigoths, like the Franks, had to navigate the question of religion. For many years, they remained Arians, creating tension with the Catholic majority of the Hispano-Roman population. This tension weakened their rule, but in the year 589, King Recarad converted to Catholicism, bringing his people into alignment with the Church. This shift mirrored the strategy of the Franks. By embracing the Roman faith, the Visigoths secured legitimacy and unity. Their kingdom endured for more than 2 centuries, blending Gothic traditions with Roman law and culture. The Visigoths compiled their own legal code, the Liber Judiciorum, which combined Roman principles with Germanic customs and would influence Spanish law for centuries. Yet the Visigothic kingdom also faced challenges. Its monarchy was often unstable, plagued by internal rivalries and assassinations. Unlike the Franks, who developed a strong dynastic tradition, the Visigoths struggled to maintain continuity of leadership. In the year 711, their kingdom collapsed suddenly when Muslim forces from North Africa, led by Tariq ibn Ziyad, invaded and conquered much of Spain. This marked the beginning of Al-Andalus, the Muslim presence in Iberia, which would endure for centuries. The fall of the Visigoths reminds us that the new kingdoms of post-Roman Europe were fragile, subject to the same forces of invasion and division that had undone Rome itself. Turning northward, across the sea to the misty island of Britain, we encounter another transformation. When Roman legions withdrew from Britain in the early 5th century, the island was left vulnerable to invasion. Over the next centuries, waves of Anglo-Saxons, tribes from present-day Germany, Denmark, and the Netherlands, crossed the sea and settled in Britain. They pushed aside or absorbed the native Celtic populations and established a patchwork of kingdoms: Wessex, Mercia, Northumbria, East Anglia, Kent, Sussex, and Essex. The Anglo-Saxon period was one of both turmoil and creativity. At first, their religion was pagan, worshipping gods like Woden and Thor, but missionaries from Rome and Ireland gradually converted them to Christianity. By the 7th century, monasteries flourished across England, producing illuminated manuscripts and fostering a vibrant culture of learning. Figures like the Venerable Bede, who wrote the ecclesiastical history of the English people, preserved both history and theology, earning him the title Father of English History. The Anglo-Saxons also developed their own language, Old English, which blended Germanic roots with Latin influences. This language would one day evolve into modern English, a legacy that still shapes our world. Each of these kingdoms, Frankish, Visigothic, Anglo-Saxon, represents a different path out of Rome's shadow. The Franks aligned themselves early with the Catholic Church and built a kingdom that would dominate Western Europe. The Visigoths struggled with religious division, but left a legacy of legal tradition before their kingdom fell to Muslim conquest. The Anglo-Saxons, isolated from the continent, forged a unique culture that blended Germanic traditions with Christian learning. Together, they reveal the diversity of post-Roman Europe, a continent no longer united under one empire, but rich with new identities, new languages, and new traditions. We must also note the Lombards, who settled in Italy in the 6th century. They carved out a kingdom in the very heart of the old empire, ruling much of the peninsula for over 200 years. Like the Visigoths, they initially followed Arian Christianity, but eventually converted to Catholicism, strengthening ties with the papacy. Their presence in Italy forced the popes to become political players, negotiating between Lombard kings, Byzantine emperors, and later Frankish rulers. The struggle between Lombards and popes set the stage for one of the most enduring institutions of medieval Europe, the Papal States, a territory governed directly by the Church. In North Africa, the Vandals established a kingdom after crossing into Roman lands in the early 5th century. They became infamous for their sack of Rome in 455, an event so memorable that their very name became synonymous with wanton destruction. Yet the Vandal kingdom was not merely destructive. In North Africa, they maintained Roman infrastructure, minted coins, and ruled as a recognized power until they were conquered by the Byzantines under Justinian in the mid-6th century. Their story, though shorter, adds to the mosaic of post-Roman kingdoms that carried forward fragments of the empire's legacy. What all these kingdoms shared was the challenge of legitimacy. To rule over former Roman lands, they had to reconcile their own traditions with the expectations of Romanized populations. They adopted Roman law, Roman titles, and Roman religion. They built palaces where Roman governors once sat, issued decrees in Latin, and sought the blessing of the Church. In doing so, they transformed themselves from tribal warlords into kings, from conquerors into rulers. They were not merely destroyers of Rome, but inheritors of its mantle, reshaping it in their own image. By the 9th and 10th centuries, the outlines of medieval Europe were clear. The Frankish Empire, under Charlemagne, sought to revive Roman unity. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms laid the foundation for England. The Visigothic legacy gave way to the Christian kingdoms of Spain that would later fight to reclaim their land in the Reconquista. The Lombards, though eventually subdued, helped shape the politics of Italy. Each of these kingdoms, born from the ruins of Rome, carried forward something of its spirit, even as they built something new. Thus, the fall of Rome did not lead to the disappearance of civilization, but to its transformation. Europe became a tapestry woven from Roman threads and barbarian yarns, stitched together by the needle of the Church. The empire was gone, but its essence lived on, in the laws, the languages, the faith, and the dreams of the new kingdoms that rose from its ashes. As we continue our journey, we will explore how these kingdoms interacted, how they defended themselves against new waves of invaders, and how, in the midst of hardship and struggle, they laid the groundwork for the Europe of the High Middle Ages. For the story of Rome's fall is not only about endings, but about beginnings, the birth of nations, the shaping of identities, and the creation of a new world that would one day give rise to the Europe we know today. The fall of Rome did not mark the end of invasion and upheaval in Europe. In fact, the centuries that followed were in many ways even more turbulent. As new kingdoms emerged from the ruins of the Western Empire, they were immediately tested by waves of external threats that swept across the continent. From the frozen seas of the north came the Vikings. From the vast steppes of the east rode the Magyars. From across the Mediterranean, Muslim armies advanced, bringing new cultures and new conflicts. These invasions reshaped Europe once more, challenging its survival, but also forging its resilience. Let us begin in the north, with the Vikings. Around the late 8th century, longships appeared on the horizon, slender vessels with dragon-prowed bows cutting through the waves. The men aboard were fierce warriors from Scandinavia, Norway, Denmark, and Sweden, driven by a combination of overpopulation, ambition, and the lure of wealth. In 793, the monastery of Lindisfarne on the coast of England was attacked, an event so shocking that chroniclers described it as the wrath of God unleashed upon the faithful. This raid is often marked as the beginning of the Viking Age. The Vikings were not merely raiders, though the image of fire and blood they left behind was unforgettable. They were also explorers, traders, and settlers. Their ships allowed them to strike deep inland, sailing up rivers into the heart of Europe. Paris itself was besieged multiple times by Viking fleets. Monasteries, rich in treasure and poorly defended, were frequent targets. Yet over time, many Vikings settled in the lands they raided. In England, they established the Danelaw, regions under Scandinavian control where Norse laws and customs prevailed. In Ireland, they founded cities like Dublin. In France, they carved out Normandy, the land of the Northmen, a duchy granted to Viking leader Rollo in 911 in exchange for his loyalty to the Frankish king. The Vikings even ventured far beyond Europe. They sailed to Iceland, Greenland, and, remarkably, to North America, where Norse settlers briefly established a colony at Vinland around the year 1000. They traded as far east as Byzantium and the Abbasid Caliphate, carrying furs, slaves, and amber, and returning with silk, silver, and spices. They were as much merchants as marauders, weaving Europe into wider networks of exchange. In the end, their invasions destabilized Europe, but their settlements and trade routes enriched it as well. The Viking Age left an indelible mark, blending Norse culture with the lands they touched. While the Vikings struck from the north, another threat galloped in from the east, the Magyars. These horsemen, descended from steppe peoples, swept into Central Europe in the 9th and 10th centuries. Their raids were swift and devastating, targeting Germany, Italy, and even as far west as France. Like the Huns before them, the Magyars relied on mobility and archery, striking quickly before vanishing back into the plains. For decades, their incursions terrorized Europe, exposing the fragility of its kingdoms. Chroniclers spoke of them as a scourge, a new wave of chaos after the fall of Rome. Yet the Magyar threat did not last forever. In the year 955, at the Battle of Lechfeld, the German king Otto I inflicted a decisive defeat on them, breaking their power. Afterward, the Magyars began to settle, adopting Christianity and building a kingdom in the Carpathian Basin that became Hungary. Like the Franks and the Visigoths before them, they transformed from raiders into rulers, integrating themselves into the fabric of Europe. Their kingdom endured, becoming a lasting part of the continent's political landscape. What had once been a terror from the east became a cornerstone of Central Europe. From the south came yet another force, the armies of Islam. In the early 7th century, the Prophet Muhammad founded Islam in Arabia. Within a century of his death, Muslim armies had conquered vast territories, stretching from Spain, across North Africa, and into the Middle East. By the early 8th century, they crossed into Iberia, defeating the Visigoths and establishing Al-Andalus, a Muslim-ruled region that became a center of culture, learning, and science. The Muslim presence in Spain lasted for centuries, profoundly shaping its history. The expansion of Islam brought both conflict and exchange. Muslim fleets raided the Mediterranean, attacking Sicily, Sardinia, and southern Italy. Even Rome itself was threatened, with Muslim forces sacking the city of St. Peter in 846. The papacy, unable to defend its own lands, turned increasingly to the Frankish kings for protection. This reliance deepened the bond between the church and secular rulers, culminating in Charlemagne's coronation as emperor in 800. The threat from the south was thus a catalyst for political change in the north. Yet the story of Muslim Europe was not only one of war. In Spain, Al-Andalus flourished as a beacon of culture. Cities like Córdoba became renowned for their libraries, scholars, and architecture. While northern Europe struggled with feudal fragmentation, Al-Andalus preserved and advanced knowledge in mathematics, medicine, and philosophy. Through contact with the Islamic world, Europe later regained classical learning that might otherwise have been lost. Thus, the Muslim presence was both a challenge and a gift, bringing conflict but also cultural enrichment. Together, these three waves, the Vikings, the Magyars, and the Muslims, tested Europe's resilience. They shattered old kingdoms, forced rulers to adapt, and reshaped political and cultural landscapes. In their wake, Europe became more defensive, building castles, fortresses, and walled cities. Feudalism deepened as local lords offered protection against raiders in exchange for service. The very structure of medieval society was hardened by the pressure of these invasions. But Europe did not simply endure, it adapted. The Vikings settled and became Normans, who later played a decisive role in the history of England and the Mediterranean. The Magyars transformed into Christian kings, anchoring Central Europe. The Muslims enriched Spain, influencing European science, art, and philosophy. These invasions were destructive, yes, but they were also transformative, forcing Europe to redefine itself and absorb new influences. Out of fire and blood, a more diverse and resilient Europe emerged. By the year 1000, the storm of invasions had begun to subside. The Viking Age waned as Scandinavians converted to Christianity and built kingdoms of their own. The Magyars settled into Hungary. Muslim expansion in Europe slowed, confined largely to Spain and Sicily. Europe entered a new phase, one of relative stability and growth. Towns began to flourish again, trade revived, and the seeds of the High Middle Ages were sown. The fall of Rome had led to centuries of upheaval, but by enduring wave after wave of invasion, Europe had been tempered like steel, ready for the transformations to come. As we continue, we will explore how this newfound stability allowed Europe to blossom, how the feudal system matured, how towns and trade revived, how the idea of Christendom united the continent, and how the dream of Rome still haunted its rulers. For though the empire had long fallen, its ghost continued to guide the hands of kings, bishops, and warriors who shaped the medieval world. By the year 1000, after centuries of upheaval and invasion, Europe began to breathe more easily. The storm of Viking raids was waning, the Magyars had settled into the Christian kingdom of Hungary, and Muslim expansion in the Mediterranean had slowed. For the first time since the collapse of the Western Roman Empire in 476, Europe found itself in a period of relative stability. And in that stability, remarkable growth began to unfold. The seeds planted in the ruins of Rome now sprouted, giving rise to the vibrant civilization of the High Middle Ages. One of the foundations of this transformation was agriculture. For centuries after Rome's fall, farming in Europe had been relatively stagnant. Fields were worked with wooden plows, yields were modest, and peasants lived at the edge of subsistence. But around the 10th century, new techniques and tools began to spread. The heavy plow, more efficient than earlier versions, allowed farmers to break the dense soils of northern Europe, opening vast new lands for cultivation. The use of the horse collar, which made it possible for horses to pull plows without choking, increased efficiency even further. At the same time, the adoption of the three-field system, rotating crops so that 1/3 of the land lay fallow each year, boosted productivity. These changes may sound modest, but their impact was enormous. With more food came population growth, healthier communities, and the possibility of specialization beyond subsistence farming. As fields flourished, towns revived. In the centuries after Rome's fall, urban life had declined sharply. Cities shrank, markets quieted, and long-distance trade nearly collapsed. But after the year 1000, towns began to reawaken. Old Roman cities, long diminished, found new life, while entirely new towns sprang up near castles, monasteries, and crossroads. Markets bustled once again with goods from near and far. Local fairs grew into major centers of commerce, drawing merchants from across regions. Slowly but steadily, Europe reconnected with the wider world. Trade routes stretched outward, linking Europe to the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic world. From the east came silks, spices, and precious metals. From the north, furs and timber. From the Mediterranean, wine and olive oil. The Italian city-states, especially Venice and Genoa, became hubs of this commerce, their ships carrying goods across the seas. In the north, the towns of Flanders and the ports of the North Sea flourished as centers of textile production and trade. The revival of commerce brought wealth, and with wealth came new possibilities. Guilds formed to regulate crafts and protect merchants. Cathedrals rose with soaring stone towers, and universities began to take root, offering education in law, medicine, and theology. With towns and trade came a shift in social structures. For centuries, Europe had been dominated by feudalism, a system built on land, loyalty, and protection. Peasants worked the land for their lords, who in turn swore loyalty to greater nobles and kings. This system provided security in a dangerous age, but it left little room for mobility.
The rise of towns, however, created new opportunities. Merchants and craftsmen, neither nobles nor peasants, formed a growing middle class.
Their wealth gave them influence. Their associations gave them power. And over time, they began to challenge the rigid hierarchies of feudal society. Europe was changing, not by abandoning its rural foundations, but by adding new layers of complexity. Religion, as always, remained central. The Church not only preserved knowledge and provided spiritual guidance, but also inspired some of the greatest achievements of the age. After 1000, Europe entered a great age of cathedral building. In towns across France, Germany, and England, stone cathedrals rose to the sky, their spires piercing the heavens, their stained glass windows glowing with color. The Romanesque style, with its thick walls and rounded arches, gave way to the Gothic, with its flying buttresses and pointed arches that allowed for height and light unimaginable in earlier centuries. These buildings were more than places of worship. They were symbols of community pride, expressions of faith, and monuments to human creativity. Even today, the great cathedrals of Chartres, Notre Dame, and Cologne remind us of the energy and vision of medieval Europe. Kings, too, began to reassert their authority. In the chaos following Rome's collapse, power had fractured into countless local hands. Lords and knights ruled their lands with little regard for distant kings. But after 1000, monarchs gradually strengthened their control. In France, the Capetian dynasty slowly expanded its power from Paris outward. In England, the Norman conquest of 1066 brought a centralized system of governance under William the Conqueror, blending Anglo-Saxon traditions with Norman feudalism. In Germany, the Holy Roman Emperors claimed the legacy of Rome, though their authority was often contested by powerful dukes and bishops. Across Europe, rulers sought to bring order to fragmented lands, building institutions that would one day evolve into the nation-states we recognize today.
Yet this new order was not without conflict. The growing power of kings sometimes clashed with the authority of the Church. Who held ultimate power, the Pope or the monarch? This question sparked fierce disputes, such as the investiture controversy in the 11th century, when popes and emperors battled over the right to appoint bishops. The Church insisted on spiritual supremacy, while kings demanded control over their own realms. These conflicts were not merely political, they revealed the enduring tension between the legacy of Rome's universal empire and the realities of a divided Europe. Still, the year 1000 marked not decline but renewal. Chroniclers of the age often wrote of fear that the world would end at the turn of the millennium, fear of famine, fear of invasion. But when the dreaded year passed without catastrophe, a new optimism seemed to take hold. People began to speak of progress, of expansion, of renewal. Monks described the earth as if it were sprouting anew. This spirit of growth was not merely symbolic. It was real, visible in the fields, the towns, the cathedrals, and the crowns of Europe. The legacy of Rome still loomed large in this reborn Europe. Latin remained the language of the Church, the universities, and diplomacy. Roman law continued to influence emerging legal systems. The idea of empire persisted, embodied in the Holy Roman Emperors who claimed to be successors of Caesar and Augustus. Even as Europe developed its own distinct identity, it looked back to Rome for inspiration, legitimacy, and guidance. Rome was gone, but Rome was never forgotten. As we continue our journey, we will turn to one of the most dramatic expressions of this renewed Europe, the Crusades.
For in the 11th century, the same energy that built cathedrals and revived towns also launched armies across continents. The Crusades were both a product of Europe's revival and a force that would transform it further, linking the continent once again to the wider world and reshaping the balance of faith, power, and culture. The fall of Rome may have ended an empire, but it set in motion a story that was only just beginning. By the late 11th century, Europe had changed dramatically from the fractured and fragile world that had followed the fall of Rome. Agriculture had expanded, towns had revived,
Kings were strengthening their crowns, and the Church stood at the height of its influence. The energy of renewal that swept across the continent after the year 1000 soon found expression in one of the most ambitious and far-reaching undertakings of the Middle Ages, the Crusades. These were wars fought not only with swords and spears, but also with prayers, banners, and visions of holy destiny. They reveal how the legacy of Rome, the authority of the Church, and the restless vigor of medieval Europe converged to launch campaigns that would reshape both East and West. The idea of the Crusades did not emerge out of nowhere. For centuries, Christian pilgrims had traveled to the Holy Land, to Jerusalem and the sacred sites where Christ had lived, preached, and died. Under Muslim rule, these pilgrimages were generally permitted, though not always without hardship. But by the late 11th century, the Byzantine Empire, heir to Rome in the east, was under growing pressure from the Seljuk Turks, a rising Muslim power. In 1071, the Byzantines suffered a crushing defeat at the Battle of Manzikert, losing much of Anatolia. Faced with this crisis, Emperor Alexius I appealed to the West for help. His call was answered in a way he could scarcely have imagined. In 1095, at the Council of Clermont in France, Pope Urban II delivered a sermon that electrified Europe. He called upon Christians to take up the cross, to march to Jerusalem, and to liberate the Holy Land from Muslim control. His words ignited a fervor that spread like wildfire. Knights, peasants, and nobles alike took vows, sewing crosses onto their garments as symbols of their mission. For many, it was a spiritual calling, a chance to atone for sins and secure salvation. For others, it was an adventure, a promise of land, wealth, and glory. For all, it was a movement unlike anything Europe had seen since the days of Rome's legions. The First Crusade, launched in 1096, was both chaotic and astonishingly successful. Bands of peasants set out first, many of them poorly armed and unprepared, and they suffered terrible losses. But the main armies of knights, organized under leaders like Godfrey of Bouillon and Raymond of Toulouse, marched through Byzantine lands and into the Levant. Against all odds, they captured Jerusalem in 1099, storming the city with ferocity. The victory was accompanied by brutal massacres that shocked even contemporaries, but for the Crusaders, it was a triumph ordained by God. Out of this conquest, they carved the Crusader states, the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the Principality of Antioch, the County of Edessa, and the County of Tripoli. For nearly a century, these fragile outposts of Latin Christendom clung to existence on the shores of the eastern Mediterranean. The Crusades reveal much about the Europe that emerged from Rome's fall. First, they showed the power of the Church. It was the Pope, not a king, who called the crusade. In a fractured Europe of competing monarchs, the Church could unite knights and nobles under a common cause. This spiritual unity echoed the old dream of Rome, a universal authority binding the continent together. Yet it also showed the independence of medieval Europe from the old empire. The Crusaders were not Roman legions, but feudal knights, driven by their own lords and ambitions as much as by papal command. The Crusades also connected Europe more deeply to the wider world. Contact with Byzantium and the Islamic states brought not only war, but also exchange. Crusaders encountered advanced medicine, mathematics, and architecture in the Muslim world. They brought back spices, silks, and ideas that enriched European life. Italian merchants, especially from Venice and Genoa, profited immensely, establishing trade networks that would fuel the rise of the Renaissance centuries later. In this sense, the Crusades were not just wars of faith, but bridges between civilizations, however violent and fraught those bridges may have been. But the Crusades were not only directed eastward. The spirit of holy war spread across Europe itself. Crusades were launched in Spain against Muslim rulers in Al-Andalus, part of the centuries-long Reconquista. Crusades were declared in the Baltic against pagan peoples, bringing Christianity to the northern forests. Even internal enemies, such as heretics in southern France, became targets of crusading zeal. The idea that war could be sanctified, that blood could be shed in the name of God, became a defining feature of medieval Europe. The legacy of Rome echoed throughout these endeavors.
The Crusaders imagined themselves as heirs to the empire, reclaiming lands that had once been part of Rome's dominion. In Jerusalem, they built fortresses and churches that combined Roman, Byzantine, and local styles.
In their titles and ceremonies, they evoked the grandeur of imperial rule. Yet their world was different. They were not unifying the Mediterranean under a single emperor, but projecting the energy of a fragmented Christendom outward. The dream of Rome persisted, but it was reshaped in the crucible of faith. The Crusades also revealed the fragility of Europe's unity. While the First Crusade succeeded, later Crusades struggled. The Second Crusade ended in failure. The Third Crusade, led by figures like Richard the Lionheart and Frederick Barbarossa, achieved some victories but failed to recapture Jerusalem, which had fallen to the great Muslim leader Saladin in 1187. The Fourth Crusade, disastrously, turned against Constantinople itself, sacking the Byzantine capital in 1204. What had begun as a mission to defend the East ended in betrayal, deepening the schism between Eastern and Western Christianity. The dream of a united Christendom fractured further, showing the limits of papal power and the competing ambitions of kings and nobles. Still, the Crusades left a profound impact. They reinforced the centrality of the Church, at least for a time. They expanded Europe's horizons, linking it to trade and knowledge from the wider world. They hardened the division between Christianity and Islam, a division that would echo through centuries. And they gave Europe a sense of shared identity, a vision of Christendom that transcended local loyalties. In their triumphs and failures, the Crusades were both a continuation of Rome's legacy and a departure from it, embodying the paradox of medieval Europe: fragmented yet united, pious yet violent, provincial yet outward-looking. By the 13th century, the crusading spirit began to wane. The Crusader states fell one by one, with Acre, the last stronghold, lost in 1291. Europe turned its attention inward, focusing on its own kingdoms and struggles. Yet the memory of the Crusades endured, shaping the imagination of generations. They stood as symbols of faith, adventure, and tragedy, reminders of both the heights and the follies of medieval Europe. And in their wake, Europe emerged more connected, more ambitious, and more aware of the wider world. As we move forward, we will explore how this Europe, strengthened by growth, scarred by crusades, and inspired by Rome's memory, entered a new phase of transformation. For the story of Rome's fall does not end with the Crusades. It continues in the rise of universities, the flowering of philosophy and science, the struggles between kings and popes, and ultimately the Renaissance that would claim to rediscover Rome itself. The empire was gone, but its ghost continued to haunt every ambition, every cathedral, and every dream of unity in the medieval world. By the 13th century, Europe had been profoundly reshaped by centuries of struggle, invasion, faith, and revival. The fall of Rome was now far in the past, 700 years gone, but its shadow still stretched across the continent. The institutions, ideas, and ambitions of medieval Europe were all in some way reflections of the lost empire. And in this age, something remarkable began to stir once more: the rebirth of learning, the rise of universities, and the first whispers of what would later blossom into the Renaissance. For centuries after Rome's collapse, education had been largely confined to monasteries and cathedral schools. Monks had preserved ancient texts by copying them in scriptoria, often without fully grasping their content. These manuscripts, however, formed the foundation for a new wave of intellectual life that began in the 11th and 12th centuries. As Europe stabilized, demand for learning grew. Kings needed literate clerks to manage administrations. The Church required trained theologians to debate doctrine. Merchants sought knowledge of arithmetic for trade. Out of this demand, the first universities emerged. The University of Bologna, founded in the late 11th century, specialized in law, drawing upon the rediscovered texts of Roman legal codes preserved by Justinian's Corpus Juris Civilis. Paris became the center of theology, with its cathedral school evolving into one of the greatest intellectual institutions of the Middle Ages. Oxford and Cambridge in England, Salamanca in Spain, and later Prague, Vienna, and Heidelberg all became beacons of learning. Unlike monastic schools, these universities were independent corporations, communities of teachers and students bound by their own rules, protected by charters, and recognized by both church and crown. They were, in many ways, heirs to the academies of Athens and the law schools of Rome, reborn in a new medieval guise. At the heart of this intellectual revival was scholasticism, a method of inquiry that sought to reconcile faith and reason. Thinkers like Anselm of Canterbury and, most famously, Thomas Aquinas asked how the truths of Christianity could be understood through the lens of philosophy, especially the works of Aristotle. Aristotle's writings had been largely unknown in Western Europe until they were reintroduced through translations from Arabic and Greek, carried by contact with the Islamic world during the Crusades and through Spain. This was one of the paradoxical gifts of the centuries. While Christians and Muslims battled, they also exchanged knowledge. Through the libraries of Córdoba and the translations of scholars like Averroes and Avicenna, Europe rediscovered the intellectual treasures of antiquity. The revival of Aristotle transformed European thought. No longer content with simple repetition of inherited texts, scholars began to question, analyze, and debate. The scholastic method emphasized dialectic, the structured exchange of arguments and counterarguments. In the halls of Paris, students wrestled with questions of logic, ethics, and metaphysics, guided by masters who sought to harmonize revelation with reason. Aquinas' Summa Theologica became the towering monument of this effort, a vast synthesis that sought to show how human reason could support divine truth. It was not always successful, nor free from controversy, but it revealed a confidence in the power of the human mind that had been absent in the early medieval centuries. This intellectual revival was not limited to theology. In medicine, texts from Galen and Hippocrates, preserved and expanded upon by Muslim scholars, were studied in universities from Salerno to Montpellier. In mathematics, Europe absorbed the Hindu-Arabic numeral system, including the revolutionary concept of zero, which transformed calculation and commerce. In astronomy, ideas from Ptolemy mingled with observations from the Islamic world, laying the groundwork for future discoveries. The arts of logic, rhetoric, and grammar, the trivium, were taught alongside the quadrivium of arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy, forming the 7 liberal arts that structured medieval education. The revival of learning was accompanied by a revival of architecture and art. Romanesque churches, with their thick walls and rounded arches, gave way to Gothic cathedrals, soaring upward with pointed arches and stained glass that bathed interiors in colored light. These cathedrals were not only places of worship, but also visual statements of Europe's growing confidence. In their height and beauty, they echoed the grandeur of Rome, even as they pointed toward heaven. The builders of Chartres, Notre Dame, and Canterbury were heirs to both Roman engineering and medieval faith, combining stone, glass, and vision into structures that still inspire awe. It was in this same period that vernacular literature began to flourish. For centuries, Latin had been the dominant language of scholarship, law, and worship.
But by the 12th and 13th centuries, poets and writers began composing in the languages of the people. In France, troubadours sang of courtly love. In Italy, Dante Alighieri composed the Divine Comedy, a masterpiece that journeyed through hell, purgatory, and paradise, blending classical influences with Christian theology. In England, Geoffrey Chaucer would later write the Canterbury Tales, stories of pilgrims told in the rhythms of Middle English. These works signaled a cultural shift. Rome's Latin legacy remained strong, but Europe was also finding its own voices, its own identities in its own tongues. The revival of cities and trade also fueled intellectual growth. Italian merchants brought not only goods but ideas from the East. Banking houses in Florence and Venice developed sophisticated systems of credit and finance.
The Hanseatic League in the north bound cities from the Baltic to the North Sea into a powerful commercial network. With wealth came patronage of art, learning, and science. The Middle Ages were not static, as older stereotypes suggest, but dynamic, innovative, and deeply connected to the wider world. And yet, in all of this, the memory of Rome remained central. The rediscovery of Roman law at Bologna reminded rulers of the power of codified systems. The architecture of cathedrals drew on Roman arches and engineering. The very structure of universities, with their faculties and degrees, echoed the organization of Roman guilds and institutions. Even as Europe forged its own identity, it did so with Rome as both foundation and aspiration. The empire was gone, but its intellectual and cultural DNA lived on in every manuscript copied, every law studied, every stone laid. By the 14th century, the stirrings of a new age were unmistakable.
The Renaissance, literally a rebirth, would look back to Greece and Rome with fresh eyes, seeking to revive their wisdom, their art, their science. But this was possible only because the Middle Ages had preserved and transformed the legacy of Rome, carrying it through centuries of turmoil. The fall of the empire had not extinguished its flame. It had passed the torch into new hands, who carried it, however imperfectly, into the future. As we move forward, we will explore how the crises of the 14th century, the Black Death, the Hundred Years' War, the Avignon Papacy, shook Europe to its core, even as the Renaissance began to dawn. The fall of Rome set Europe on a path of both suffering and renewal, decline and rebirth. And in these next chapters, we will see how the continent weathered some of its darkest hours, only to emerge with new vigor, ready to rediscover the glory of the ancient world and to chart its own course toward modernity. By the dawn of the 14th century, Europe stood at a crossroads. The High Middle Ages had been a time of growth, optimism, and expansion. Fields were fertile, towns were bustling, universities were thriving, and cathedrals soared above the skyline. For a moment, it seemed as though Europe had fully overcome the long shadow of Rome's fall, building a civilization that was vibrant and self-confident. Yet history, as it so often does, brought new trials. The 14th century would prove to be one of the most turbulent eras in European history, a time of plague, war, and crisis. And paradoxically, it was precisely through these hardships that Europe was prepared for the dawn of the Renaissance. The most devastating of these crises was the Black Death.
Between 1347 and 1351, the bubonic plague swept across Europe, carried by fleas on rats that traveled along trade routes from Asia. It struck with terrifying speed. Victims developed painful swellings or buboes, fever, and delirium, often dying within days. Entire villages were wiped out. Cities saw corpses pile in the streets. Chroniclers, struggling to find words, described the pestilence as divine punishment, the end of days, or an inexplicable terror. By the time the first wave passed, perhaps 1/3 to 1/2 of Europe's population had perished. Never before had the continent experienced such a catastrophe. The impact of the Black Death was profound. With so many lives lost, labor became scarce. Fields lay fallow, harvests withered, and economic structures were shaken. Yet scarcity also gave surviving peasants new leverage. In some regions, they demanded higher wages or greater freedoms, leading to revolts when lords resisted. The old order of feudalism, already weakened, was strained further. Social mobility increased as the rigid hierarchies of the Middle Ages cracked under the weight of demographic collapse. In towns, guilds faced shortages of apprentices and masters alike, forcing them to adapt. Paradoxically, out of this devastation came new opportunities, a redistribution of wealth and power that began to reshape society. The plague also left deep marks on culture and thought. Art and literature turned increasingly toward themes of death and mortality. The Danse Macabre, or Dance of Death, depicted skeletons leading kings and peasants alike in a grim procession, a reminder that death spared no one.
Writers like Giovanni Boccaccio, in his Decameron, captured both the horror of the plague and the resilience of human wit and desire for life. The Church, which had offered comfort and guidance, found its authority challenged, as many asked why God had allowed such suffering.
Some turned to mysticism, seeking personal visions of faith, while others grew cynical, disillusioned with institutions that seemed powerless against the pestilence. The plague did not destroy medieval Christianity, but it did plant seeds of doubt and questioning that would later bear fruit in the Reformation. If disease was one scourge of the 14th century, war was another. From 1337 to 1453, England and France were locked in the Hundred Years' War, a conflict that reshaped both kingdoms. It was not one continuous war, but a series of campaigns, truces, and renewed hostilities, driven by disputes over dynastic succession and territorial control. The war introduced new forms of warfare. Longbowmen at battles like Crécy and Agincourt demonstrated that common soldiers could defeat knights, challenging the supremacy of the mounted warrior that had dominated medieval battlefields for centuries. Gunpowder weapons, introduced in the later phases of the war, heralded an even greater revolution in military technology. The age of castles and knights was waning, giving way to professional armies and artillery. The war also gave rise to figures who became legends. In France, Joan of Arc, a peasant girl who claimed divine visions, rallied French forces and turned the tide of the conflict before her capture and execution. Her story embodied the intense intertwining of faith, politics, and identity that characterized the late Middle Ages. In England, kings like Edward III and Henry V sought glory and conquest, binding their kingdoms together under banners of national pride. Though the war was brutal and destructive, it contributed to the emergence of stronger national identities in both England and France, laying the groundwork for the modern nation-state. Meanwhile, the papacy faced crises of its own.
In 1309, the papal court moved from Rome to Avignon, where it remained for nearly 70 years in what came to be called the Babylonian captivity of the Church. During this time, the papacy was heavily influenced by French kings, undermining its claim to universal authority. When the papacy finally returned to Rome, disputes over succession led to the Great Schism, 1378 to 1417, when rival popes reigned in Rome and Avignon, each claiming legitimacy. For nearly 40 years, Christendom was divided, its unity shattered. Councils were convened to resolve the schism, but the damage to papal prestige was lasting. The image of the Pope as supreme spiritual leader, heir to St. Peter, and guardian of Rome's legacy was tarnished. In the eyes of many, the Church was not the unshakable rock it claimed to be, but a political institution vulnerable to corruption and conflict. All of these crises, the plague, the war, the schism, combined to shake Europe's foundations. Yet they also forced adaptation. Feudalism weakened, giving way to stronger monarchies and more centralized states. The economy, though devastated, gradually recovered with new vigor, driven by trade and banking. Intellectual life, far from extinguished, was stimulated by crisis. The questioning of authority, the rediscovery of classical texts, the new emphasis on human experience and mortality, all of these currents flowed into the stream of the Renaissance. In Italy especially, the Renaissance began to bloom in the 14th century. The wealth of city-states like Florence, Venice, and Milan, enriched by trade, allowed patrons to support artists, scholars, and architects. Figures like Petrarch, often called the father of humanism, looked back to Rome and Greece with reverence, seeking to revive their language, style, and spirit.
Humanism emphasized the dignity of man, the power of reason, and the beauty of earthly life, a striking contrast to the death-haunted art of the plague years. Yet even this revival was built on the foundations of medieval labor. The monks who had preserved manuscripts, the universities that had debated Aristotle, the merchants who had connected Europe to the wider world, all were heirs of Rome, carrying its legacy into a new age. Thus, the 14th century was both an age of catastrophe and of transformation. It revealed the fragility of human life, the limits of institutions, and the persistence of conflict. But it also cleared the ground for renewal, forcing Europe to confront its past and reimagine its future. Rome had fallen nearly 1,000 years earlier, yet its memory was alive in every cathedral, every university, every debate about law, power, and faith. The crises of the 14th century did not erase that legacy. They sharpened it, making it more urgent. In the fires of plague and war, Europe was tempered once more, prepared for the brilliant dawn of the Renaissance that lay ahead. As we continue, we will step into that dawn, into the 15th century, when artists like Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo, thinkers like Erasmus and Machiavelli, and explorers like Columbus would reshape the world. In their works and journeys, we will see not only the rebirth of classical antiquity, but also the final transformation of Rome's legacy, from fallen empire to enduring inspiration, a ghost that continued to guide Europe into the modern age. As the 15th century dawned, Europe stood on the threshold of a new era. The crises of the 14th century, the Black Death, the Hundred Years' War, the Great Schism, had scarred the continent but also reshaped it. From the ruins of tragedy emerged resilience, wealth, and a hunger for renewal. Nowhere was this more visible than in Italy, where the Renaissance, or rebirth, began to take form. It was a rebirth not only of art and knowledge, but of the very memory of Rome, whose ghost had haunted Europe for nearly a millennium. In the Renaissance, that ghost became a guiding spirit, inspiring artists, thinkers, and rulers to revive the grandeur of antiquity while forging a path into the modern world. The Renaissance was, at its heart, a cultural movement. Humanism, its intellectual foundation, placed the human being at the center of thought. Medieval scholasticism had often sought to harmonize faith and reason, but humanism turned directly to the texts of Greece and Rome for wisdom. Figures like Petrarch, who lived in the 14th century, collected ancient manuscripts, studying Cicero and Virgil not simply for their content, but for their style, their elegance, their sense of humanity. He and his successors believed that by imitating the classics, Europe could regain the lost eloquence and moral clarity of antiquity. In Florence, the beating heart of the Renaissance, patrons like the Medici family poured their wealth into supporting artists, architects, and scholars. They saw themselves as heirs to Roman greatness, reviving its glory in marble, canvas, and ink. Architecture reflected this vision most vividly. Filippo Brunelleschi, inspired by Roman engineering, designed the Great Dome of Florence Cathedral, an achievement that echoed the Pantheon of Rome but pushed the limits of contemporary technology. His dome was not only a triumph of architecture, but a symbol of Florence's claim to be a new Rome, a city of power, beauty, and destiny. Art, too, underwent a revolution. Medieval art had been symbolic, emphasizing spiritual truths through stylized forms. Renaissance art embraced realism, perspective, and the human form. Painters like Masaccio pioneered linear perspective, giving depth and dimension to their works. Leonardo da Vinci studied anatomy to capture the subtleties of muscle and motion, blending science and art in a way Rome itself would have admired. Michelangelo, sculpting his David, evoked the perfection of classical statues, yet infused them with the energy and confidence of a new age. The Sistine Chapel, painted with biblical scenes but in the grandeur of classical form, embodied the union of Christian faith and Roman heritage that defined the Renaissance. Literature, too, drew deeply from antiquity. Dante's Divine Comedy, written in the early 14th century, had already pointed the way by blending Christian theology with classical figures like Virgil. In the 15th and 16th centuries, humanist writers flourished in every corner of Europe. In England, Thomas More wrote Utopia, envisioning an ideal society with echoes of Plato's Republic. In the Netherlands, Erasmus championed a Christianity rooted in learning and moral reform, blending classical wisdom with faith. Niccolo Machiavelli in The Prince drew upon Roman history to craft a brutally realistic guide to power, showing how rulers might secure stability in a turbulent world.
In all of these works, the memory of Rome was not abstract, but practical, a source of models, lessons, and inspiration. The Renaissance was also an age of science and discovery. The rediscovery of ancient texts in mathematics, astronomy, and medicine, many preserved by the Islamic world, fueled new inquiry. Yet Renaissance thinkers did not merely repeat the ancients, they questioned them. Copernicus, studying the heavens, revived the heliocentric idea that the Earth revolved around the Sun, a theory known to some ancient philosophers but long neglected.
This marked the beginning of a scientific revolution that would challenge old authorities and reshape humanity's understanding of the cosmos. Vesalius, dissecting the human body, corrected errors in Galen's anatomy, bringing medicine closer to accuracy. Galileo, building upon classical physics, used the telescope to observe the moons of Jupiter, challenging the geocentric worldview. In this way, the Renaissance honored Rome while also moving beyond it, embodying the principle that to truly inherit the past was to surpass it. The spirit of discovery extended beyond books and laboratories to the seas. Inspired in part by ancient geographers and driven by the desire for trade and expansion, European explorers set sail into unknown waters. Christopher Columbus, in 1492, crossed the Atlantic and opened the New World to European eyes. Vasco da Gama reached India by sailing around Africa, linking Europe directly to the riches of the East. Ferdinand Magellan's expedition circumnavigated the globe. These voyages, though often bringing conquest and exploitation, expanded Europe's horizons immeasurably, ushering in an age of global interaction. In their ambition and daring, these explorers echoed the Roman legions who once marched to the ends of the known world. But now the reach was wider, the stage larger. Politically, the Renaissance also drew upon Rome's legacy. Rulers sought not only to wield power, but to embody imperial grandeur. In Italy, city-states like Florence, Venice, and Milan competed for supremacy, each claiming the mantle of Roman heritage. In France, England, and Spain, monarchs strengthened their crowns, building centralized states with bureaucracies reminiscent of Roman administration. The Holy Roman Empire, though fragmented, continued to invoke the name of Rome, a reminder of the unbroken line of ambition that stretched from Augustus to the emperors of Germany. Even the papacy, scarred by the crises of the 14th century, sought renewal through art and politics. Popes like Julius II and Leo X turned Rome into a Renaissance capital, commissioning works from Michelangelo and Raphael that revived the splendor of the ancient city. Yet the Renaissance was not simply a return to Rome, it was also a transformation. The humanism of the age emphasized individual dignity and potential, a shift from the communal and hierarchical structures of medieval society. The printing press, invented by Johannes Gutenberg in the mid-15th century, revolutionized communication. Books, once laboriously copied by hand, could now be produced in large numbers, spreading ideas quickly and widely. This democratization of knowledge broke the monopoly of monasteries and universities, empowering merchants, artisans, and anyone who could read. It was a technological revolution as profound as any Rome had achieved, and it ensured that the ideas of the Renaissance would not be confined to a few, but would sweep across the continent. In the Renaissance, Europe rediscovered Rome not as a fallen empire, but as a living legacy. Its art, its laws, its literature, and its vision of human greatness all returned, reshaped and renewed. The fall of Rome had once plunged Europe into fragmentation, but in its memory, Europe found unity and purpose. The dream of Rome was reborn, not in legions and emperors, but in scholars, artists, and thinkers who believed that by looking backward, they could move forward. It was a paradox. The fall of Rome had made the Renaissance possible. Without the long centuries of preservation, transformation, and crisis, there could have been no rebirth.
As we continue our journey, we will explore how this Renaissance, so deeply rooted in Rome's legacy, paved the way for even greater transformations. The Reformation, which would shatter Christendom. the scientific revolution, which would overturn the old worldviews, and the age of exploration, which would extend Europe's reach to every corner of the globe. The fall of Rome was an ending, yes, but it was also the beginning of a story still unfolding, a story in which Europe, haunted and inspired by its ancient past, marched toward modernity. By the early 16th century, the Renaissance had revived Europe's intellectual and artistic life, reconnecting it to the grandeur of Rome. Cathedrals and palaces gleamed, paintings and sculptures celebrated the beauty of the human form, and humanist scholars studied the wisdom of antiquity. Yet beneath this flourishing surface, deep tensions ran through the very heart of Christendom. The Church, which had long been the unifying institution of Europe and the most enduring heir of Rome's legacy, faced growing criticism. Its authority, wealth, and practices were increasingly called into question. Out of this tension erupted one of the most transformative events in European history, the Protestant Reformation. The roots of the Reformation stretched back centuries. The Avignon papacy and the Great Schism of the 14th century had weakened papal prestige. Corruption within the Church, simony, nepotism, and the sale of indulgences had sparked discontent. Humanist scholars, inspired by the Renaissance, began to study the Bible in its original languages, bypassing medieval commentaries and uncovering discrepancies between Scripture and church practice. Figures like Erasmus of Rotterdam, though remaining loyal to Catholicism, criticized abuses and called for reform through education and a return to the simplicity of the gospel.
The printing press, a recent invention, spread these critiques widely, ensuring that debates once confined to scholars could now reach merchants, artisans, and peasants. Into this environment stepped Martin Luther, an Augustinian monk and professor in Wittenberg. In 1517, he famously posted his 95 Theses, a document challenging the practice of selling indulgences, which were marketed as promises of reduced time in purgatory. Luther's intent was not to destroy the Church, but to provoke scholarly debate. Yet his theses, copied and printed, spread across Europe with astonishing speed. What might have been a local academic dispute became a continental revolution. Luther's message resonated because it touched upon profound concerns. He argued that salvation came not through indulgences, rituals, or even the authority of the Pope, but through faith alone, sola fide. The Bible, he insisted, was the sole authority, sola scriptura, and should be available to all believers, not locked away in Latin, but translated into vernacular languages. To many, these ideas were liberating. They undermined the monopoly of the clergy and empowered individuals to seek God directly. They also resonated with rulers and princes, who saw in them an opportunity to assert independence from Rome's authority and to seize church lands and wealth. The Reformation spread rapidly. In Switzerland, Ulrich Zwingli led reforms in Zurich, emphasizing a strict interpretation of Scripture. John Calvin in Geneva developed a theology of predestination and discipline that would profoundly shape Protestant thought. In England, King Henry VIII broke with Rome not over theology but over politics and personal matters, establishing the Church of England. What began as a movement for reform splintered into multiple branches, each interpreting Scripture in its own way. Christendom, once united under the Pope, fractured irreparably. The consequences were immense. Wars of religion erupted across Europe, tearing apart kingdoms and communities.
The 30 Years' War in the 17th century would be one of the most devastating conflicts in European history, rooted in these divisions. The Catholic Church, far from collapsing, responded with its own counter-reformation. The Council of Trent reaffirmed Catholic doctrine, reformed abuses, and launched a wave of renewal through the Jesuits and other new orders. Baroque art, with its grandeur and drama, became a weapon of faith, intended to inspire awe and devotion. Europe was no longer united under a single Christian authority, but divided into Catholic and Protestant spheres, a division that endures to this day. The Reformation, like so many other events in European history, cannot be understood without Rome's shadow.
The very idea of a universal church stretching across borders and languages was Rome's legacy. The corruption and bureaucracy that provoked reform were also legacies of Rome's centralized structures. And the reformers themselves, in turning to Scripture and the early church, often imagined themselves as returning to a purer, pre-Roman Christianity. Rome's fall had left a fragmented Europe, and now, 1,000 years later, that fragmentation was mirrored in religion. The unity once provided by empire and then by the church was gone, replaced by diversity, conflict, and pluralism. Yet, just as the fall of Rome had not meant the end of civilization, so too the Reformation was not merely destruction. It unleashed new energies. Literacy spread as people sought to read the Bible in their own languages. Education flourished as Protestant communities emphasized schools for boys and girls alike. Political thought evolved as rulers and subjects debated authority, conscience, and resistance. The wars and turmoil were terrible, but they reshaped Europe into a continent where diversity of belief became an enduring reality.
The Reformation was, in its own way, another rebirth, a painful, fiery one, but a rebirth nonetheless. At the same time, the Reformation intersected with other forces transforming Europe. The Renaissance continued to flourish, science advanced, and exploration expanded horizons. The discovery of the New World and the colonization that followed changed Europe's relationship to the rest of the globe. In all of this, the memory of Rome persisted. Reformers compared the papacy to the corrupt emperors of late antiquity, while Catholic defenders likened themselves to guardians of Rome's true legacy. Both sides claimed Rome even as they fought over its meaning. Thus, the Reformation was both a break and a continuation. It broke the unity of medieval Christendom, but it continued the long story that began with the fall of Rome, the story of fragmentation, adaptation, and transformation. Once again, Europe was remade, not as an empire, not as a single church, but as a patchwork of nations, faiths, and cultures, bound together by the echoes of a fallen empire that refused to be forgotten. As we move forward, we will explore how these transformations, the Renaissance, the Reformation, the Scientific Revolution, and the Age of Exploration, together propelled Europe into the modern age. The fall of Rome was no longer a distant memory, but a living force, shaping the very foundations of the world we know today. And in the next chapter, we will turn to the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment, when reason and inquiry would once again challenge old authorities and redefine humanity's place in the cosmos. By the 17th century, Europe had already been transformed by the Renaissance and shaken by the Reformation. The printing press had spread ideas with unprecedented speed. Voyages of discovery had connected the continents, and the legacy of Rome continued to echo through politics, art, and law. Yet something even more profound was stirring, something that would redefine humanity's understanding of the universe itself: the scientific revolution. For centuries, knowledge in Europe had been guided by the authority of the ancients and the teachings of the Church. Aristotle's physics, Ptolemy's astronomy, Galen's medicine, all had shaped medieval thought. They were inherited from antiquity, preserved through the chaos after Rome's fall, and revived in the Renaissance. But now, thinkers began to test these authorities, to measure, to observe, to experiment. They no longer accepted truth simply because it was written in a venerable book. They demanded proof from nature itself. This marked a fundamental shift. It was as if Europe, after 1,000 years in the long twilight after Rome, suddenly opened its eyes to the dawn of modern science. One of the most pivotal figures was Nicolaus Copernicus, a Polish cleric and mathematician. In 1543, he published On the Revolutions of the Heavenly Spheres, proposing that the Earth revolved around the Sun, not the other way around. This heliocentric theory overturned the geocentric cosmos that had dominated thought since antiquity. Copernicus drew on ancient hints from Greek philosophers like Aristarchus, but his bold synthesis challenged both Aristotle and the Church's interpretation of Scripture.
Though his work was initially met with caution, it planted a seed that would grow into a revolution. In the 17th century, Galileo Galilei in Italy used the telescope, a relatively new invention, to observe the heavens. He saw mountains on the moon, moons orbiting Jupiter, and countless stars invisible to the naked eye. These discoveries confirmed Copernicus's vision and shattered the old worldview.
Galileo championed the idea that nature was written in the language of mathematics, that observation and experiment were the path to truth. For this, he faced opposition from the Church, which saw his heliocentrism as heresy. Yet his ideas could not be silenced. The world was already changing. Johannes Kepler, working in the Holy Roman Empire, refined Copernicus's model, showing that planets moved in ellipses rather than perfect circles. Isaac Newton in England synthesized the work of Copernicus, Kepler, and Galileo in his Principia Mathematica of 1687. With the law of universal gravitation and the principles of motion, Newton provided a framework that explained the movements of both earthly and heavenly bodies. For centuries, humanity had looked to the skies with awe and speculation. Now, with Newton's laws, they could predict the dance of the planets with precision. It was a triumph of reason, a leap beyond anything Rome had imagined. The scientific revolution extended beyond astronomy. In medicine, Andreas Vesalius dissected human bodies, correcting errors that had persisted since Galen. William Harvey discovered the circulation of blood, revolutionizing physiology. In chemistry, Robert Boyle laid the foundations of modern experimentation. The scientific method itself, observation, hypothesis, experiment, conclusion, became a new way of engaging with the world, a method that prized evidence over authority. This was not simply new knowledge, it was a new way of knowing. The legacy of Rome was present even here. The Latin language remained the medium of scientific discourse, connecting scholars across borders. Ancient texts provided the starting point, even when they were overturned. Roman engineering inspired experiments with mechanics. But the spirit of inquiry moved beyond Rome, breaking free of ancient constraints. If Rome had built aqueducts and roads, Europe now built telescopes, microscopes, and laboratories.
The old empire had conquered the world with legions. The new Europe sought to conquer nature with reason. This intellectual transformation flowed seamlessly into the Enlightenment of the 18th century. If science could illuminate the workings of the cosmos, why not apply reason to human society, politics, and morality? Philosophers, known as philosophes, began to ask whether kings ruled by divine right, whether laws were just, whether human beings might govern themselves. Just as Newton had discovered natural laws in physics, Enlightenment thinkers sought natural laws of society. In France, Voltaire championed freedom of thought, mocking tyranny and superstition with biting wit. Montesquieu analyzed governments in The Spirit of the Laws, arguing for separation of powers, a principle that would inspire constitutions centuries later. Jean-Jacques Rousseau in The Social Contract declared that sovereignty belonged to the people, not monarchs. In Scotland, Adam Smith laid the foundations of modern economics with The Wealth of Nations, envisioning markets guided by an invisible hand. In Germany, Immanuel Kant urged humanity to dare to know, to emerge from self-imposed immaturity through the use of reason. The Enlightenment was, in many ways, Rome reborn, not in emperors and legions, but in law, philosophy, and civic ideals. The republics of antiquity inspired dreams of liberty. Roman law provided a framework for modern legal codes. Latin mottos in Roman architecture adorned the institutions of the age. Yet, the Enlightenment also went further, questioning authority in ways Rome never had. Where Rome demanded obedience, the Enlightenment demanded liberty. Where Rome exalted empire, the Enlightenment exalted the individual. It was both heir and challenger to antiquity. This era also revealed how deeply interconnected the world had become. The discoveries of explorers, the trade of merchants, the wealth of colonies, all fed the Enlightenment's debates.
Coffee houses in London and Paris buzzed with conversation, fueled by goods brought from across the seas. Encyclopedias compiled knowledge in a manner reminiscent of Roman compendiums, but on a scale Rome could never have achieved. The Enlightenment was global, even if it was centered in Europe, reflecting a world forever changed since Rome's fall. Yet, as with every rebirth, tensions abounded. Kings adopted Enlightenment ideals selectively, embracing science and reform while resisting true democracy. The Church, though weakened, still opposed many radical ideas. Ordinary people, often excluded from the salons of the elite, felt the inequalities of society keenly. These tensions would soon erupt into revolutions that shook the world. Just as Rome had fallen when its institutions could no longer meet the needs of its people, so too would the monarchies of Europe face challenges from below, inspired by Enlightenment thought. Thus, the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment represented another great turning point in the long story that began with Rome. They transformed Europe's relationship to knowledge, power, and faith. They carried forward Rome's legacy of law and reason, but also broke free from its limits, daring to imagine a world of liberty, equality, and universal rights. The fall of Rome had set Europe on a path of fragmentation and renewal, and now, more than a millennium later, that path had led to a world poised for revolution. As we move into the next chapter, we will see how the Enlightenment's ideals burst into reality in the American and French revolutions. In these uprisings, citizens would invoke the models of Rome, its republic, its senate, its citizen soldiers, while also seeking to transcend them, creating new political orders that would reshape the modern world. The empire had fallen, but its spirit was about to inspire revolutions that changed history forever.
By the late 18th century, the Enlightenment had reshaped the intellectual landscape of Europe. Philosophers had questioned monarchy, debated the nature of law, and proclaimed the dignity of the individual. The printing press had spread these ideas across continents, and coffee houses, salons, and universities buzzed with conversations about liberty, equality, and reason. Yet ideas, no matter how powerful, must eventually find expression in action. And in the final decades of the century, action came in the form of revolutions that transformed not only Europe but the world. The American Revolution was the first great experiment in bringing Enlightenment ideals into reality. The 13 colonies in North America, long ruled by the British Crown, grew increasingly resentful of taxation without representation and imperial control. Inspired by the writings of John Locke, Montesquieu, and other Enlightenment thinkers, colonial leaders declared that government derived its legitimacy not from kings but from the consent of the governed. In 1776, they issued the Declaration of Independence, drafted by Thomas Jefferson, proclaiming that all men are created equal and endowed with unalienable rights. These words echoed both the natural rights philosophy of the Enlightenment and the civic ideals of Rome. The revolution that followed was fought not only with muskets and cannons, but with ideas. The Continental Congress functioned as a kind of Senate, embodying representative government. George Washington, the commander of the Continental Army, was often likened to Cincinnatus, the Roman farmer general who returned to his plow after serving the Republic. When Washington resigned his command and later stepped down after 2 presidential terms, he consciously imitated this Roman model of virtuous leadership. The very architecture of the new nation reflected Rome. Capitol buildings with columns and domes, Latin mottos like E pluribus unum, out of many, one.
The United States was not Rome reborn, but it was Rome remembered, its republican ideals reinterpreted for a new age. The success of the American Revolution reverberated across the Atlantic. In France, where Enlightenment thought was even more vibrant, the example of the Americans emboldened reformers and radicals. The French monarchy, burdened by debt and resistant to reform, faced growing discontent. When the Estates General met in 1789, it unleashed forces that could not be contained.
The French Revolution began with demands for constitutional monarchy, but soon escalated into a profound reimagining of society. In the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, the revolutionaries proclaimed liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression as the natural rights of all people. These principles drew directly from Enlightenment philosophy, but their expression was steeped in Roman imagery. The revolutionaries admired the Roman Republic as a model of civic virtue. They invoked Brutus and Cicero as heroes, symbols of resistance against tyranny. In revolutionary festivals, citizens wore Roman togas and caps of liberty, parading through streets adorned with classical motifs. The guillotine, grim as it was, stood as an emblem of equal justice, echoing the Roman belief in law applied without distinction. The revolution in France, however, was far more turbulent than in America. Where Washington imitated Cincinnatus, French leaders struggled with the temptations of power. The Republic gave way to the Reign of Terror, where thousands were executed in the name of liberty. Out of the chaos rose Napoleon Bonaparte, a figure who embodied both the revolutionary spirit and the imperial ambition of Rome. In 1804, when Napoleon crowned himself emperor in Notre Dame Cathedral, he consciously evoked Caesar and Augustus, casting himself as the new heir of Rome's grandeur.
His legal code, the Napoleonic Code, distilled Enlightenment principles of equality before the law, property rights, and secular authority, and it remains one of the most influential legal systems in the world, another echo of Roman law transformed for modern times. The American and French revolutions, though different in form and outcome, both reveal how deeply the legacy of Rome was intertwined with the birth of modernity. Rome had once fallen, leaving Europe fragmented, but its memory endured in law, in architecture, in civic ideals. The Enlightenment rekindled these memories, and the revolutions gave them flesh. Where medieval Europe had looked to Rome as a dream of empire, the modern age looked to Rome as a dream of republic, of law, of citizenship. These revolutions also marked the beginning of something Rome had never achieved, the notion of universal rights. The Roman Republic had been for Roman citizens, not for all. The empires of Caesar and Augustus ruled vast territories, but never proclaimed equality for all peoples. In America and France, however imperfectly, the idea emerged that liberty and equality belonged not to a privileged few, but to all mankind. This was the true revolution, the expansion of Roman ideals beyond Rome itself into a universal vision. Of course, reality lagged behind ideals. Slavery persisted in America, and women were excluded from political rights in both revolutions. The French Revolution descended into violence, and Napoleon's empire brought conquest and oppression. Yet the ideals proclaimed in these revolutions could not be contained. They spread across Europe and the world, inspiring movements for independence, reform, and democracy. The ghost of Rome, once a reminder of imperial grandeur, now whispered of liberty, equality, and fraternity. As the 19th century unfolded, these revolutionary ideals collided with industrialization, nationalism, and the reshaping of Europe's political map.
The legacy of Rome would once again be invoked, in parliaments, in revolutions, in monuments built to symbolize unity and power. And in our final chapter, we will reflect on how Rome's fall, more than a millennium earlier, continues to shape the modern world we live in today. As our journey comes to a close, we find ourselves standing not in the ruins of Rome, but in the present, looking back across nearly 2,000 years of history. We began with a question: why did the Roman Empire fall, and how did that fall reshape Europe? Along the way, we have traced the story of decline, survival, transformation, and renewal. And now, at the end of our path, we see that Rome never truly disappeared. Its legacy is all around us, woven into the very fabric of the modern world. Rome's fall in 476 after Christ marked the end of a centralized empire in the West, but it was not the end of Roman influence. In law, Rome endures in every court and constitution that values justice, equality before the law, and the rights of citizens. The Napoleonic Code, the American Constitution, and countless legal systems across the globe trace their ancestry to Roman jurisprudence. When judges deliberate, when contracts are written, when rights are defended, Rome's voice still echoes. In language, Rome lives in Latin. Though no longer spoken as a common tongue, Latin survives in the Romance languages, Italian, French, Spanish, Portuguese, and Romanian, and in countless words borrowed into English and other languages. It is the language of science, of medicine, of law. It shapes our vocabulary, our mottos, our very way of expression. When we speak of senates and forums, when we say per capita or status quo, we are speaking with Rome's tongue.
In architecture and engineering, Rome is all around us. Domes, arches, aqueducts, and amphitheaters provided models that architects have imitated for centuries. From the U.S. Capitol to the Arc de Triomphe in Paris, from railway stations to modern stadiums, Roman forms inspire our buildings. Concrete, that seemingly humble invention of Roman engineers, is the foundation of our modern cities. Rome built for eternity, and eternity has not forgotten. In politics and civic life, Rome's shadow is unmistakable. The idea of the Republic, government by laws and representatives, was Rome's great gift, revived in the Renaissance, reborn in the Enlightenment, and realized in modern democracies. The balance of power, the duties of citizenship, the concept of public service, these are Roman ideals, still debated in parliaments and congresses around the world. Even the warning of Rome's fall, that empires are mortal, that power can decay, remains relevant, a caution to every nation that imagines itself eternal. In culture, Rome has been a constant companion. From Renaissance paintings of Roman gods and emperors to Hollywood epics of gladiators and legions, Rome has captured the imagination. Its myths and histories, Romulus and Remus, Julius Caesar, the fall of the city to the Visigoths, are told and retold as lessons, as warnings, as inspirations. Rome is not only remembered, it is reimagined, each generation finding in it what it needs: glory, decadence, courage, or decline. But perhaps Rome's greatest legacy lies in the way its fall reshaped Europe and the world. The collapse of the Western Empire gave rise to new kingdoms, new languages, and new cultures. It forced Europe to adapt, to reinvent itself, to carry forward fragments of the old into something new. Without Rome's fall, there would have been no Middle Ages, no Renaissance, no Reformation, no Enlightenment, no modern world as we know it. The fall was not an ending, but a transformation, a passing of the torch from one age to another. So, what does Rome mean to us today? It means that civilizations rise and fall, but their influence endures. It means that even in collapse, seeds of renewal are sown. It means that the past is never truly past, but lives within us, shaping our laws, our languages, our cities, and our dreams. To study Rome is to study ourselves, for we are its heirs, its descendants, its living legacy. As you listen to these words tonight, perhaps on a quiet evening or as you drift to sleep, remember that history is never a straight line. It is a cycle of growth and decline, of death and rebirth. Rome fell, but Rome lives on, in every courthouse, in every parliament, in every word of Latin that crosses our lips. And in this way, the question we asked at the beginning has its answer. Rome fell, but Rome never truly ended. It is part of us still. Thank you for joining us on this journey through time, here at Night Owl Podcast History. If you enjoyed traveling back into the world of Rome with us, do not forget to subscribe and share this story with friends who love history. Together, we keep the past alive, not as a relic, but as a guide to understanding who we are today. And as the night deepens, may the lessons of history remind us: empires may fall, but memory endures. Rome's story is our story, and its echoes will never fade.